Good evening, everyone, and you're all very welcome to this evening's session on podcasting. And I'm delighted to introduce our presenter this evening, who's Paul O'Mahony. And Paul is a member of two clubs in County Cork, in Blarney Toastmasters and Toastmasters for Golf. He's also past Division A director, and he's also one of three presenters on the Talk Show for Talkers podcast. So please help me welcome Paul O'Mahony to the virtual stage. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Madam Program Quality Director. Well, thank you all very much for coming. As Brenda said, I'm Paul O'Mahony. I have been podcasting since 2008. I started using an app called Audio Boo, and on that website there are 3,400 and something individual episodes that I've recorded. I have engaged to excess in podcasting, some might say, but I'm here this evening to do my very best to provide you with something worthwhile. So this is a session on podcasting. The title is Podcasting in One Easy Lesson. The one easy lesson is the next 55 minutes or so. The session is going to be structured into a general introduction to what podcasting is about. Then I'm going to interview a Toastmaster who has recently completed the Pathways project, which is called Create a Podcast. And thirdly, I'm going to cover how you can start and set up a podcast. In other words, the nuts and bolts. So let's just go back a second. The purpose is to satisfy your current interest. I do not yet know what your current interest in podcasting is. And I'm here also to help you to become a podcaster. Question to you all, would you please put into the chat all those of you who want to become a podcaster, who actually want to produce a podcast? Would you please write yes? I think there are about 40 people. No, there are 53 people here. I would like to get a semblance of whether I should balance the whole of the session on how to get you to get your podcast going within the next week to 10 days, or whether you're here to learn generally about podcasts in order to become better educated, to be able to understand what a podcast is, understand how you might be able to listen to them. I'm just trying to get a feel for what proportion of the entire audience here intends to become a podcaster. The best way in Toastmasters for you to prove that you intend to become a podcaster, I might say, is to find the Pathways project entitled Create a Podcast and get in touch with your Vice President for Education and schedule yourself to deliver. Then you have a date for delivering, and you have a space of time in between now and then for you to immerse yourself in the learning material that is to be found in the Toastmasters education program and do what needs to be done. And I'm here to help you to do that this evening. Just a few little things as a way of kind of whetting your appetite about what on earth is a podcast. Well, let's go on. Podcast is radio. It's radio. Many of you surely grew up loving radio, listening to it. Some of you may listen to it today. Half an hour long programs, not just the news, comedy, detective yarns, science fiction, the whole lot. Here, is something to show you that Toastmasters is up to date these days. Here are two guys, Ryan and Greg. These two guys live in America, and they are the two co-hosts, what we call in podcasting, the talents, who present the Toastmasters podcast. So there they are. They produce a superb podcast. It's been going, I think, if I remember rightly, 2007. So there are a huge number of episodes. They're on a massive number of topics. So Toastmasters has put in recent times, by putting within its education program podcasting, it has realized that podcasting is a modern communication medium in which it's us who are, let's blow our own trumpet. We're all pretty expert on how to communicate. We're all able to start a speech in an interesting way, hold the attention of the audience all the way through, vary the elements that are there within the speech and come to a wonderful conclusion. You need all of those abilities to be a podcaster, just as you need them in all sorts of other situations. In Ireland, this is the most popular podcast. You may be shocked, guys, but my therapist ghosted me. This is the #1 podcast in Ireland. Now, you notice the image. The image is giving a message. So it immediately becomes either fantastically attractive to you or absolutely off-putting. But this image has been made specially to convey the ethos, not just the name, but the ethos, and also to give you an idea of who are the human beings behind it. What about in the UK? A good number of you are from the UK, I know. This is the #1 UK podcaster. I'm going to leave out the Joe Rogan podcast, which is the most listened to one, but he comes out of America. Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO. Completely different type of podcast. You can tell, a different kind of radio show, if you like. The man is incredibly successful, has a business, and some of you, for all I know, might have listened to his podcast. I can't tell because I'm looking at the slides at the moment, whether you are. Now, going on from there, here is a club, a Toastmasters club, that has got its own podcast, just started very recently. It's in District 91. Here is the Shilling Toastmasters podcast. That's an image that has been made for it. And here is our own much loved Irish Talkers podcast, popularly known as the Talk Show for Talkers. 4 episodes a week. And I see in front of me Moira O'Brien, who is the backbone of that podcast. I'm just one of the co-presenters. She's the sound editor. She's the one who knocks Ted Malanfi and myself into shape. That has been going for about 7 years, and it has been well supported by District 71 during that time. And so there we are. That's the background. I would like to rest you from slides for a minute and just say a few things, if I can get out of here and tell you that. Great. So how's that for a start? Is anybody smiling there? Is anybody interested? I see some people have gone to sleep. They've turned off their screens. I count everybody who turns off their screens as being asleep. That's just a personal view. It may not be true, but there we are. So look, what's podcasting? As I say, I've got a few questions here. What, why, who, where, and how? What's podcasting? Yeah, it's a radio show. But the handy thing about it is that the listeners can listen to it anytime they like. Some of you maybe have gone to sleep with a podcast. Hands up all those who go to sleep every night listening to a podcast. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Moira. My wife does. Carmen, thank you very much. Thank you, Robert. Yes, absolutely. Perfectly legitimate thing to do. How many of you listen to podcasts while driving in a car? Driving in a car. Danny listened to podcasts all day. Carmen, Robert, again, Sean Dewan in the car. Yeah, you can listen to podcasts in the bath, right? Let's say. And the other thing is, you know, podcasters make episodes and they make them available, but they often always have a back catalog. You don't have to listen to the most recent ones. You can listen to stuff that was recorded 6-7 years ago. It's ever so handy. And it's in keeping with the modern generation's wish to curate their own media. In the old days, we had to listen to a program at 1 o'clock and that was it. Now you can listen to the program that went out at 1 o'clock at whatever time you like. And radio stations are doing the same thing. Why is it a useful means of communications? It's useful because lots of people, increasing numbers every year, are listening to podcasts. Now, when I joined Toastmasters in 2015, it was almost impossible for me to find a Toastmaster who knew what a podcast was. Now, of course, some of you were hiding and I didn't realize, but the key thing is there was almost nobody in Toastmasters I could find who could tell me that they'd listened to a podcast in the previous 6 months. And innumerable people told me, how would I find a podcast anyway? So it's getting easier and easier, and we do need to move with the times. It is also a phenomenal place to practice your communication skills. We'll come on to that later on, but podcasts are a place to practice your fluency. And we have ways of getting rid of your ums and ahs. We'll be dealing with that later on too, when we get to editing. Who does it? Who does podcasting? All sorts of people do podcasting. There are an increasing number of Toastmasters who do podcasting. And in a few minutes, very shortly, I'm going to introduce you to somebody who's in the audience today who is a Toastmaster, who's become a podcaster. That'll be good, won't it? Okay, so where can you find podcasts? Very, very easy. Just go to Google, put in podcasts on fly fishing. You'll get a list. Put in podcasts on skateboarding. What's the thing that John McFadden does? He goes around on a board. Paddle boarding. Podcasts on paddle boarding. John McFadden, unmute yourself. I have a question for you. John, have you got a podcast on paddle boarding?
I don't have a podcast on paddle boarding, but there are a few, maybe a small number out there, and I've been honored to be a guest on one of them twice. So I'm familiar-ish.
Super, John. Pop the names of 1 or 2 paddleboarding podcasts into the chat. There are people here this whole session is going to give you a chance to find out about other podcasts. How does Pathways help you? Pathways, the project in Pathways, let me tell you, is superb. Absolutely superb. Now, I'm a guy who's deeply immersed in training resources, training material, how to design courses for donkey's years, way back into the 1980s. The Pathways project, creative podcast, is superb. I've even cut all the writing out of it and put it into a PDF that if somebody asks me privately in the chat, I'll send it to you afterwards. I'm not 100% sure whether I'm breaking copyright if I give it to everybody here. So basically, it is superb. Now, I want to introduce you to Dave Gregg. Dave, will you please, Geroid, will you highlight Dave Gregg so that Dave and I can be on the screen together?
Hi, Paul.
Wonderful. So we're both great. Dave, we're going to record a podcast episode. Now, I have to tell people, by the way, the podcast is the general name for the show, and an episode is each individual recording of it. So I'm going to record a podcast episode with Dave Gregg, and I'm going to do it like as if I was the host. Dave, we're going to do this really quickly. Are you ready to be quick?
I am, yes, just okay. Go for it, yeah.
That's great. Okay. So welcome to the Dave, Greg and Paul O'Mahony podcast. It's terrific to have you here listening with us. Today, I'm going to interview Dave Gregg. Now, Dave Gregg comes all the way from Aberdeen, that cold place up there in Scotland where it was snowing today and he had his galoshes on. Dave, you're very welcome here. You've been a Toastmaster for a number of years, and you're also a member of Blarney Toastmasters and Aberdeen Toastmasters.
Yes, thanks for that plug there, Paul, for Blarney and Aberdeen as well.
Great stuff. Now, today, Dave, I don't want to talk to you about Aberdeen or Blarney. I want to find out. Now, everybody knows, Dave, that you recently are one of the very first people in District 71 to complete the Pathways Project Create a Podcast. And I hope you're very proud, but I want to find out from you, Dave, when you started working, and I was your coach and I'm your mentor, let's admit, I'm your mentor and I coached you in this thing. What did you know about podcasting when we started the work together?
I knew very little, Paul, before I started the project. As you mentioned, there's quite a few high-profile people in the podcasting world. Joe Rogan, I do like him now. I like Russell Brand, and I've heard about a few others as well. But apart from that, I didn't hardly even listen to any podcast, to the truth be known.
So basically, you hadn't a clue, and you never.
Well, I did have a clue, but not much
before.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that you've done it, now that you've gone through the whole process of producing your own podcast, what do you think of that project in Pathways?
For me, on a personal level, I really enjoyed it, specifically because it went away from the traditional approach that I've been so used to doing speeches. And for myself, I do like that form of communication. And I've been told I'm quite good at it as well. Sitting down with somebody, listening to them, which is a skill in itself, and being able to interject at appropriate moments to tease out the, again, appropriate information to add color or whatever to a communication and conversation. So I found it really worthwhile and valuable, because my intention is to hopefully carry on, but that's another discussion.
Dave, in a nutshell, give me a few specific things you learned in really short sound bites. What specific things did you learn that you didn't know already?
What did I learn that I didn't know already? Podcast software. I learned uploading a podcast. I learned about editing a podcast. Yeah, those things which are pretty substantial in the podcasting field.
So it really helps people to broaden their ability to communicate using certain tools that they might not be used to using already.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, correct. And looking back now, they're not particularly that difficult to use either. But unless somebody knows the sequence to implement them, then they're going to be out there in the kind of podcast ether and not really know what to do. But once you know, then it's Bob's your uncle or Robert's your relative.
Dave, just two more little things, just to let our listeners hear about. Have you any intention to keep up this podcasting lark?
I have, Paul. Yeah, thanks for asking me that. As a plug for my podcast, no, I have, but it needs. I'm going to go to a graphic designer to get album cover, so to speak, as you said, the image. That's a selling point in itself. I've no intention of making money from it. It's more from a personal introducing friends to my particular theme, which is creativity, how it impacts on people in their lives, and how I can help others too, and health as well. Health aspects.
What's the name of your podcast?
The name of the podcast is Health and Wealth, and that's wealth with a W-E-L-L.
Good stuff. And the last question, Dave, before we hand back to the studio. The last question, Dave, is would you recommend Toastmasters who are here today to have a go at podcasting?
Yeah, I certainly would. If you want to delve into kind of multitasking or multi-skilled, an area, definitely. For myself, again, it's helped me to realize there's far more, but there is more than just a traditional approach to delivering speeches. And I've learned a lot about it. And it has actually tapped into the enthusiastic part that I have to connect people together via a podcast.
Well, Dave, you've been a superb guest. You're a real credit to yourself and brilliant. Congratulations. We'll have Joe Rogan on next week. So we'll be sure to kind of he'll follow in a good tradition. But Dave Gregg, please, let's all applaud Dave Gregg. Thank you. Superb. That is the end of the interview. That will be turned into a podcast episode because Garrod, the Zoom master, will send me the audio file and I will ensure that you're all able to receive that as a podcast in the near future. Let me just deal now. I'm going to show you all the technology you need, because a lot of the time people talk about how complex it all is. And I suggest you keep some notes from now on. It would be a good thing to have some notes to share or to keep the notes, because I'm going to do a lot of communicating quickly. Right. The very first thing you can do to record your podcast is use the piece of software developed by this team. Does anyone recognize them? I wouldn't expect you to be able to recognize them without reading the small print. That's the Zoom team. That's the business that developed let's get it bigger. Yeah. Now you can see it's the founder and the whole thing. So Zoom, what we're talking on today, will produce for you an audio file. And the standard will be pretty good and easily good enough for 99.9% of you who are not professional podcasters. So that's, I strongly recommend Zoom. Now, you won't always be able to be sitting in your office, or you might want to go out in the streets and do a podcast which involves asking people questions or ambient sounds. You might want to get on a skateboard. You might want to just get out and about. Use this. Use Voice Record Pro. Download the app and use it. I'm only going to recommend one thing. Use that app. So make a note of that and use it, is my advice. Now that you've got the sound recorded, either in one place or the other, and you can have bits of sound from all sorts of places when you're doing a podcast, you will want to edit them all together, and this is what you are to use. Will you please write down the name Audacity? You are to use Audacity. Those of you who know the 95 other software programs you could use, you can use whatever you like, but Audacity, yeah. Anyway, Audacity. Now, I want to draw your attention to something you see in the background. The symbol in the front is what Audacity looks like when you have it downloaded. You're going to have to, as a podcaster, get used to something that completely flummoxed me at the beginning. That thing at the back is called a sound wave. That thing at the back with all those squiggly lines and ups and downs, that is where you're going to do your editing. Now, you do notice that Dave gave some rather long answers to at least one of the questions. Now, I'm a podcaster and I've decided that Dave was too long-winded. So I'm going to edit Dave's contribution down. That's the kind of thinking you have. You don't have to interrupt somebody you're interviewing for sake of argument. You can allow them to carry on for as long as they like. And when you pull the piece of audio into Audacity, you simply mark the bit you want to delete. There are all sorts of sophistications you will get used to as time goes on, but at a very simple level, you pull a piece of a file, you dump it into Audacity, and you delete the bits you don't want. It's as easy as that. So you've done Audacity, you've edited your piece of audio. The next thing you're going to have to do, you need to put it up on the internet. So you put it onto Anchor. That's another thing to write down. Anchor is a free app. It's also got a website. It's owned by Spotify. It was bought by Spotify, which is probably the biggest place where people are going to listen to your podcast. So there you are. You put it into Anchor. I have an exercise for you all now, if I can find a way of getting out of here and stop the screen share, hopefully. Right, now, one of the things you're going to have to do when you're going to do a podcast is you have to have a topic. So for this exercise, you're going to need a piece of paper. One sheet of paper, one sheet of A4, please. I want you to do something very quickly now, all of you. You won't be asked to reveal what it is. Write down the topic you want to podcast about. Now, it could be, we've already mentioned skateboarding and surfboarding. It could be about photography. It could be about politics. It could be about music. Just write a topic down. Okay, that's what your podcast is going to be about. The next thing I want you to do is, now that you've got a topic, why are you going to make this podcast? What is your purpose? Is it to educate people? Is it to entertain people? Is it to motivate people? In other words, persuade people to change their minds. If I tell you that, for example, you might be podcasting about global warming because you actually believe that global warming is very dangerous, and what you really want to do is to bring to people's attention that global warming people need to do something about it, that's a persuasive podcast, isn't it? You can have dispassionate thing. You can do podcasts about people who are in history. You're not trying to persuade anyone to love Genghis Khan. You're basically only trying to educate people about Genghis Khan. So what is your purpose? So now we've got, I hope you have written down the title of your, no, not the title, the topic and the purpose. Now, I want you to invent a title for your podcast. Invent a name. Now, ideally, don't pick a name that everybody else is using. Okay, you can change your mind. So all of this is, now I got 1/4 thing I want you to do. I want you to decide the style of your podcast. And there are two basic styles. One I'm going to call raw. Raw style is when you do no editing. You leave in all the ums and ahs. You leave in the barking dog in the background. You leave in the clanking cups in a restaurant. You go out into society and you record sound. You can even do a podcast about bird sounds. You can do anything you like. Just think about the amount of freedom you have. You don't even have to talk on a podcast. It does help, and it's fairly unusual if you don't. but you don't have to do an awful lot of it, especially if you're a DJ and you decide, right, I'm going to be a DJ podcast. I'm going to sing to everybody. I'm going to say hardly anything, but I'm going to play my own music. So you can have, the Moira O'Brien show, and you pick up your guitar and you perform. Now, forgive me, all those of you, it could also be the Gerard Murphy show. Whatever it is, I can't see many names as I'm talking here at the moment. So you have now got a raw style, but then the alternative then is edit. Now on the edit style, it's different. You record stuff and you then edit. Now I know a professional sound engineer who would spend 6 hours editing a 10-minute piece of audio. We're talking about serious time that can be spent. It's almost limitless on what you can do. You can actually take half words out of one place and substitute them into a half word in another place. You can do magic as an editor. I'm not urging you to do that. You'll be 10 years before you complete your Toastmasters project if you do that. But essentially you can edit it. You can prepare in advance the questions you're going to ask an interviewee. You can even send them to the interviewee in advance and say, these are the 4 questions I'm going to ask you. You can script everything if you want to. Or else you can do the raw approach, which is much more freestyle. Find your own interest, is my advice all the way through this. So if I'm right, you've got yourself a podcast topic, you've got the purpose of the podcast, you've got the name of the podcast, you've got the style of the podcast. You've all decided, yes, you've got a piece of paper, you've all made a decision, no procrastination, no say I'll do both of them or anything like that. You've got it all planned. Okay. You now need to take a look at your own timetable. How much time do you have available? That'll depend upon how important this is to you. You have issues to do with the time you'll spend recording the podcast, how much time you'll spend editing it. But essentially, that is what you need to do. Now, in a second, I'm going to go on to how you do it. But I'm going to stop because I'm now going to ask some of you to ask me a question. So I'm going to have a little opportunity now, because I know if I ask you who wants to ask a question, you'll all be so polite that nobody will ask a question at all. So I'm going to say, based on everything we've covered so far, well, let me go to John McFadden. I know you will have a question. John, ask me one question, please.
Do you have any, I think most podcasts seem to follow an interview style format. Do you have any tips for interviewing?
I have, John. I have one big tip, which is do the Pathways project on how to interview people. There is a mass of educational resources there on how to do interviews, stuff about open questions, closed questions, all of that. Look up on the internet a whole load of advice about how to interview people. It's all over the place, John. No, a wonderful question, though. Wonderful question. Do not think that you only have Pathways Education there to help you. You have the whole internet. I'm going to ask in a minute, I'm going to ask Moira O'Brien a question, or to ask me a question, and then I'm going to go to Sean Dewan to ask me a question. So Moira, please ask me a question.
Well, there is a question in the chat that somebody has put. It's Michael Kenny. He says, I was interviewed on a podcast. Can I use this interview on my Toastmasters Pathways project?
No. No, you can't. Or else, well, look, in Toastmasters, you can do anything you like. You can do anything you like, and you will receive credit for it. So what I'm saying, if you want to follow what the project requires, it requires you not to be interviewed, It requires you to make the podcast yourself. You have to record it. You have to give it a name. It's your podcast, not somebody else's podcast. So I refer you to the thing, but no is the simple answer. Now let me go to, I said Sean Dewan. Sean, ask me a question and then I'll go to Gay and then I'm going to move on.
Paul, a question in relation to the actual content of the podcast. What would you say is the number one thing you would need from the speaking point of view? Forget about all the editing and all the rest of it. What's the number one thing you would think is absolutely crucial when you're actually speaking via the podcast?
To not bore the pants off people. And use all the skills you use in Toastmasters of vocal variety, different pitch, different sound, to be an interesting person. Otherwise, people aren't going to listen to you. Okay?
Thank you, Paul.
We do have James Finnegan with his hand up as well.
I'm only taking one more question. I'm sorry,
Okay.
I need to move on. Otherwise, those of you who want to know how to do a podcast we'll run out of time. But Gay.
Now, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Basically, I know this might come later, but it is relevant. Okay, I'm fascinated, we'll say, by, I don't know, anything you like, cats. Why the heck would anybody why would they bother to find me? And unless you've got something very scintillating, which a Toastmasters project mightn't be so scintillating, why would people waste their time, if you like, listening to you? And how would they have found you? How would you get your contact on air, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I'll cover that in the next bit, Gay.
Right.
I'll cover that. And thanks.
Thank you.
That's actually the most important question that could have been asked. How on earth am I going to get anyone to listen to it? I'll give you one quick tip. First of all, get your son, your daughter, your mother, your uncle, your aunt, your extended family to listen to it. They ought to be willing to do you a favor. That's a good start, at least. And but we'll come on to this in a minute. I'm going to share the screen again because I want to get into the nuts and bolts of how to do it. The next bit will be pretty rapid fire. So you will, I suggest, take notes because we're now getting into how to do it in a few steps. So here we go. How to start podcasting in 5 easy steps. And we covered them already. You have to pick a topic. You have to have a clear purpose. You have to own a name. Now, this is a relevant thing. You can find out easily what podcast names are being used already by simply Googling it. You can go into Spotify. For those of you who know what Spotify is, you can search within Spotify under the section that is to do with podcasts and put a name in, and you'll find a whole load of podcasts that use that particular word. Ideally, you want to own a name. So, for example, the Michael Kenny Show, you can have your own name. It's not the only way to do it, but that at least, that's not a bad start. On the other hand, if you want to say, Toastmasters on Fire, that might be a title. You might find there was no podcast called Toastmasters on Fire. You could also have anyway, you can make up a title yourself. You have to adopt a style, and you want to keep the style consistent from episode to episode. Let me just repeat that the podcast is the big thing and the episodes are the individual shows. So you want to have a consistency, because if you're going to build up a listenership, people have to be able to predict what it is they're going to hear when they tune in. You won't get all that many listeners if every time your episodes are different from each other. So design an image. You will need to design an image. You have to put up something. The image can be a blank orange color or a color with the name of the podcast. It can be terribly simple, but it can also be very sophisticated. So there's the first step, when we covered that already. Now let's go on to the next step, which is how to assemble your podcast. This part is 5 key things. You have to record the content. Well, that's pretty obvious. And you use the recording devices we've already spoken about, or I've already recommended to you. Then you have to think about every single episode on the podcast has to start in the same way. So you have to have an introduction, and you need to write down maybe 20 words. Perhaps there's no magic figure, but this, I would highly suggest that you write it down, you script it, you speak it, you record it, you get it to the practice recording it so that it comes out of your mouth like a natural speaking voice. So that's what's called the intro in podcasting. If you listen to Irish Talkers, the talk show for talkers, every single episode, and we record 4 of them a week, 4 12-minute episodes a week. It's one of the most frequent episodes from Toastmasters anywhere in the world. So it always begins in the same way. And then you have to record the ending. And you know, it's a sandwich thing. The intro, the content, and the outro. And you have to script that. And it's not difficult. You can change your script. At the beginning, for purposes of the Toastmasters project, I suggest you just do a 1 take. Just learn. Don't try to be perfect. Next part is, do any of you remember the Kennedys of Castle Ross? Or do any of you watch EastEnders? Or do any of you tune into the Archers? They all have music, don't they? And as soon as you hear 1, 2 bars of that music, you know where you are. You need to get a piece of music. It needs to be originals. Well, you need to own the music. Don't steal anybody else's music. That's a different topic. But basically, you'll need a piece of music. Only a short piece at the beginning and a short piece at the end. That would be my recommendation. That's it. Now, the last thing is you have to stitch the whole thing together. How do you stitch the whole thing together? Come on, tell me. How did I tell you how to stitch it all together? What software did I tell you to use?
To edit it.
Audacity.
Audacity.
Who said Audacity?
Moi.
Top of the class. Excellent. Yeah, Audacity. I'm recommending that. You can put everything into Audacity. Now, how to use Audacity? This isn't a technical episode today, but go to YouTube, put in, how do I join bits of audio together in Audacity? That's how to use the internet. You probably all know this already, but just use plain language. How do I stitch a podcast together? How do I join bits of audio together? And for those of you who are very sophisticated and you want to have, music in the background while you speak over the top of it, go into YouTube and find out how you do that. None of this stuff is very complicated and it's all explained. And once you've got the hang of doing 3 or 4 episodes, you will realize that this is really easy to do. And you'll then be focusing not on the technical side, how to get the podcast up and all that. You'll be concentrating on your content. Either who'll I interview next? And by the way, John said that a lot of podcasts, he's absolutely right. A lot of podcasts are interviews, but there's lots of other formats. Don't have to be interviews. You can get a panel of people together. You can bring your recording device into a Toastmasters meeting, run a panel discussion, record the whole thing and turn it into a podcast episode. You have incredible flexibility. Okay, the last point is back to Gay's point, really, and this is the key thing. This is the absolutely key thing. Now, how do we distribute it? You upload it onto the internet. That's the first step. This is how you're ever going to get anyone to listen to it. By the way, you can always send a piece of audio privately in an email to somebody without ever putting it on the internet, just to clarify that. You could always send content to somebody and say, hey, I'm thinking of putting this into my podcast. Do you think it's any good? But my advice to you would be just upload it on, what did I say was the thing to put it up onto? What was the piece of software I said that?
Audacity.
Anchor.
Anchor.
Who said Anchor?
I did.
Joint top of the class. Brilliant. Tell your friends and family, right? This is where you start, guys. Friends and family, they are your natural supporters, unless you're going to talk about something that your family disapprove of, right? But they're the place to start. Send them the link. Send it to them via WhatsApp. If you've got connections all over the world, via WhatsApp, via email, via anything. Okay, obviously, I'm not going to go into social media, but sending people the link clearly is a reference to using your Facebook, your anything you like, sending it to people. Now, here's where we get into marketing. You have an ideal audience. I haven't used that phrase yet. You have an ideal audience for your podcast. In other words, do you remember back when I said did you want to entertain people with your podcast? Do you remember that? Yeah. But who do you want to entertain? Not every, okay, I'm going to be very blunt. Not every Tom, Dick, and Harry is your ideal audience. Your ideal audience may be a small niche of experts in a particular field. Your niche is not the whole world. Think about, who do you want to entertain? Who do you want to educate? It might well be you want your podcast only to go to members of your own Toastmasters club, members in your own area, members in your own division, members in your own district, or the whole of Region 10. You might, who knows? You are in control. You are the boss. So you send it, and then we come to marketing like mad. And Gay, that is what you have to do. Now, look, there are people in your club who specialize in marketing. They are learning the ropes in marketing. They're the vice president for public relations, aren't they? The vice president for public relations is already thinking about how can we market this club? Well, you might find you have a vice president for public relations who will help you to think about how you do marketing. It's a whole area, and marketing your podcast is, I'm going to be very cheeky. It's the second part of this session this evening. Now, no, it's for another day, another time, but we have got a public relations manager in our district who is lead person on marketing. They might be able to help in some way, but the key thing is marketing the podcast matters. Now, we have a few minutes for questions. If I was on top of my game or I had a personal assistant, I'd have been able to read the questions in the chat. Let me just ask a couple of people. Put your hand up and you can ask a question, please. Okay, Marty Ogborn. Marty Ogborn from the United States. I know you well. Marty, what's your question?
Thank you very much. I have a question about Audacity. Is it required to purchase the application, or is the free application sufficient?
The free one is sufficient.
Thank you.
There is no paid one. It is a free app.
Okay.
The Audacity is a free app?
Yeah. You don't have to worry about that. I'm looking at Garrod with his red light. Another question from somebody there?
James has had his hand up.
James Finnegan, where are you? James, what was your question? And then Vinod, you're next after James.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. It's been a fascinating lecture. What's the one mistake that you would say, don't ever do that?
Apart from swearing in public on your podcast, Toastmasters podcast, apart from that, I would say learn from every single mistake There is the bigger mistake you make, the bigger the learning you're going to make. So I would be in favor of big mistakes.
That's what the captain of the Titanic said.
Okay, thanks, James. Great. Vinod, you're next.
Good evening, all. Thanks, Paul. Brilliant podcasting lecture today. The question I have for you is, why podcasting? Why did you choose podcasting as something you are passionate about?
Well, you know, I'm a writer, and it came to me a long time ago that I'd been writing all my life, but there are a whole load of people who don't like reading. So I decided that it was time that I started to use my voice. So look, that's biography. The key thing is, do remember, there are plenty of people who don't like reading books, who don't like reading emails, who actually prefer to listen to the human voice. Not everybody, but there we are. Gearóid, you must guide me. Do I need to stop? I do, don't I? I want to thank you all ever so much for this evening. It's been a pleasure to communicate with you, and I hope a goodly number of you take up podcasting and find that create a podcast project and do it. Thank you very, very much. Back to you, Program Quality Director.
Thank you very much, Paul. Can we all unmute, please, and give Paul a round of applause, please, for his presentation this evening? Thank you very much, Paul. That was very interesting, and I'm sure full of helpful tips and hints for all of us to try out podcasting. And I saw a message in the chat from, sorry, I just want to find it because I thought it was really good. When I can't find it, but it was about trying something new and don't worry about making mistakes. So try something new, make the mistakes, learn from it, and go on to make even a better podcast. So thank you very much, Paul. Before we close out this evening's session, tonight's session is the last session before Easter. I'd like to thank all the presenters who have presented the Tuesday training sessions of the last 10 weeks or so since the start of February. I'd like to thank our Zoom team, Gearóid and Cameron. Thank you very much to you both for supporting the Tuesday sessions. And finally, I'd like to thank Danny Banks, who has put all these training sessions together. Can we unmute again and give Danny a massive round of applause? He has worked really hard on all these sessions. Thank you very much, Danny. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for your participation and for your attendance at the Tuesday training sessions. It has been a pleasure to put these sessions together and hold them on a Tuesday. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Stay safe and well, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you, everyone.